Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go with another podcast episode where I get the chance to talk with another accessibility practitioner. And today I am speaking with Jamie Knight. Hello, Jamie. How are you today?
Hello, I'm good. Thanks. Yourself?
I'm really good, and I'm talking from my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's headquarters in Seattle, Washington. Where are you talking to us from?
I'm talking to you from my half-built lounge. It's a bit like a TV set. You don't want to see what's on the other side of the camera. In sunny Romford, just outside London. It might not actually be that sunny. It's probably wet and miserable outside. I've not looked. It's safer not to look. But yeah, that's where I'm from today.
Well, did you say Rumford? I'm not familiar with that. Is that a suburb of the London metropolitan area?
Okay, so technically it's Greater London. We're a London borough, but we're kind of a small town large town on the outside of London that London kind of came out to meet. So a lot of people in Romford remember when it was part of Essex, but now it's part of London. So it's kind of on the border, right on the edge of London. It's like medium to large size town, but close enough to the city that I can get there when I need to. It's a good compromise.
Well, thanks for being here. I always enjoy the opportunity to have international visitors to this podcast, so we get a lot of different perspectives from around the world. Like usual on this program, best place to start is if you could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing right now.
So I'm actually in the middle of a transition at the moment, which is quite interesting. So back in May, I finished just shy of 11 years with the BBC, doing accessibility and research and stuff like that. And now I'm kind of rebuilding my life. I say that I'm building it around play and adventure. So play is things like events and workshops and podcasting and all that sort of stuff, but also Lego and gaming and game testing and all that sort of stuff. And then the adventures are the bike rides, but also, traveling different places and doing different things and meeting interesting people and all sorts of stuff. So I'm sort of doing a lot of different things. I'm running workshops for various organizations that I know. I found myself with a slightly niche thing of doing I don't know how to put it, a friendly phone call with lots of heads of accessibility. So various universities and broadcasters and other people that I know. I seem to end up on the phone chatting to them about accessibility quite often. So doing stuff like that. And then that's kind of like one side of my life. And then the other side of my life is I look after a piece of software for catching financial crime. So a bit of a different thing, but a friend of mine, Wookie, who some people will know from CSUN. He supported me at CSUN a few years ago. He's a money laundering reporting officer. And many years ago, we were building a kit car together. And he said something along the lines of, all of the transaction monitoring software is rubbish. And I had the worst thought a developer can ever have and went, that doesn't sound too tricky. So 4 years later, and we have a transaction monitoring platform that we look after, and we look after about $10 billion worth of payments a day. But that's my side gig, which I know sounds a bit weird, like the financial crime detection tool. That's my side project. The main thing I'm doing is the accessibility stuff. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. Lion's mostly just doing antelope management, making sure I don't get eaten by antelope, chasing away any deer, that sort of stuff. Good snuggles.
Well, I'd like to hear about your work at the BBC that you've moved away from. But one of the ways that I usually like to operate is to kind of go back in time and find out when you first, when accessibility became relevant to you and thinking about it as a profession. We can kind of work back up to the present day. So where did it start for you?
Time travel effect. So I had a slightly odd start on the whole internet thing, in that when I was a fairly young child, 9 or 10, I didn't really go outside much and do outside things. I like mountain biking, which is something I still do, which I'll come on to in a bit, is actually a bit strange. But I didn't do a paper round, I didn't do a retail shop, but I built websites. And in my mind, built websites meant I designed them too. So from about 9 through to about 17, 18, I was designing and building websites essentially for pocket money and for friends and building different things. Um, I got onto a forum called Boag World when I was a teenager, and in my later teenage years, I was homeless, and I basically just was picking up work off of Boag World. So I would do bits of design for people, bits of development, making things. So I did that for, gosh, from about 9 to 21, so about 12 years of just making things and experimenting and doing stuff like that. And then I got offered a role up in London. So I was getting ready to move to London, but the role wasn't going to start for 3 or 4 months. So I was kind of looking around at what to do in the meantime. And a friend of mine, Ian Pouncey, was at the BBC and said, "Hey, you should think about coming to the BBC, just 3 months to a year, just, get yourself settled in London, people you know are nearby, you'll probably find it quite interesting." And BBC Radio and Music have this like prototyping job going. Why don't you have a look? So I applied for it, and Ian, being the gentleman that he was, he took a taxi from the office to come and collect me from the station, because it was about my fourth time moving to London, like traveling to London, from down south in the UK, because I'm from Somerset, where we all talk like pirates, which is great actually. My dad, when he starts talking to other people from Somerset, he sounds more and more and more like a pirate, and then when he's not talking to other people from Somerset, he sounds less and less and less like a pirate, which is kind of entertaining. Um, so yeah, so Ian came and picked me up from the station. I went and did the interview. I'd never really done an interview for development stuff before, so I kind of sat there and talked about Lion and talked about some things I'd built. I'd been doing some work for Channel 4, which is another UK broadcaster, and Dogs Trust, which is a large charity. Been doing subcontracting for other agencies and stuff. So I just kind of sat there and was like, "Yeah, I can write JavaScript. I built a non-linear video editor for Channel 4. Does that count? You'd like drag and drop things onto a timeline?" And they're like, "Sure, yeah, cool, you're hired." So that's kind of how I ended up at the BBC. I meant to be there for, 3 to 6 months, maybe a year, and I was there just shy of 11 years. So I'm not sure if that went really well or really badly, kind of both.
Well,
um,
you went through, quickly, a kind of big part of your early life in career. But when you mentioned you were doing your own informal, I guess, contract work with for web development, did accessibility come into your thinking at all at
it
that
was.
time? When was it something that first resonated with you as something that that was out there?
So I kind of have an interesting mix of impairments myself. So I'm autistic. I also have a spinal cord injury, hence the big blue chair with the harness so I don't fall out sideways, which is part of what makes the bike riding pretty crazy, but I'll come on to that in a bit. Um, and I was kind of building websites and building things, but I'm an AT user myself. So I ended up building things like my own screen reading tools and my own page comprehension tools and bits of software where, because I was homeless, I had I was basically building websites in like the library and stuff like that. And I had this Nokia E61 smartphone. At the time, I also didn't have much speech. So it was how I communicated with everybody, by typing on it and then showing it to them. It's just before I kind of got proper assistive communication tools. And on that Nokia E61, it had an unlimited amount of MSN network, MSN Messenger. So I could send unlimited numbers of MSN messages, but every other data service was expensive and I couldn't afford it. So I built a tool that analyzed web pages, turned them into a series of MSN messages, and then sent them to me. And I kind of built a basic screen reader so I could navigate web pages remotely using messages from my phone. And I found that a much more effective way to interact with the web. So I guess a lot of it was, I didn't know accessibility was special. It's just part of building things. I've always kind of been on the progressive enhancement and kind of that side of things. So I didn't really know it was a specialism until one day in probably about 2008, something like that. I'd got a free ticket to go to a conference. I think it was the Future of Web Design or something. I think they used to be called Carsonified, the company who did them. They'd given me this free ticket. I'd done some writing, I think, for .NET Mag about something or other, can't remember. And I kind of got lost and was wandering around, and I found this really nice quiet room. And I really liked it because there was hundreds of people upstairs. Not my bag. Like, hide, hide, hide. And I got chatting to a lovely chap. And it turns out I'd walked into the speakers lounge, and it was Bruce Lawson. And I got chatting to Bruce and talking about what I do, and he kind of picked up that I was quite naughty. I had a big fluffy lion with me, and yeah, I got to know Bruce Lawson, and he was a good influence and kind of introduced me to the idea that accessibility is a thing. And that I'd actually built an accessibility tool, and I didn't really understand it. And then that kind of led to meeting Henny Swan because they both worked at Opera at the time. And then with that, also meeting Lady Moonan and lots of other people such as Ian Pouncey. So the other time that I'd been to London before Ian collected me off the train to go for my interview was to actually do a talk about using the web and being autistic for Opera. I think it was called Accessibility Next, and it was the cognitive accessibility version. So from the point where I went from kind of being, I don't know how you put it, self-employed, making websites for friends, family, small businesses, and the occasional piece of big subcontracting, to the point where my career started properly when I was about 20, already, 12 years into doing this. I actually started to understand that a large part of what I did was called accessibility. I didn't really know that. It was just building things properly. And then kind of when I got into the BBC, I started as a prototyper. And I had this fantastic year and a half, sat next to a wonderful designer called Sasha. And we prototyped out this thing, and it was for a certain radio network, and we showed it to them, and we built all the accessibility in because the BBC, of course you do that. I got to know Ian and Henny and the accessibility team a bit, and got to meet Gareth Ford Williams, who's the head of accessibility for the BBC. We used to sit on top of Television Centre. So in Television Centre, there was a staff bar right on the top, and you had a wonderful view of the sky, so we'd go stargazing. And one of my favorite little quirks of that building is it's a 1 million square foot building, but they had nowhere to store the chips in the cafe. So they had little wooden sheds on the roof full of freezers full of chips, which is the most BBC solution to anything ever. Just put a shed on the roof, it's fine. Nobody can see it. So yeah, so I met Gareth and Ian and the rest of the accessibility team that way. We did this prototype, and the radio network we built it for really didn't like it. However, all the other radio networks went, ooh, we like. And I kind of got to a chat with after the kind of I was coming up to the end of my time there. I was kind of looking ready to move on, and I kind of got called into a meeting with the head of radio, Andrew, and I kind of thought I was fired. I wasn't sure whether I was fired or not, and he was like, "So this prototype, how hard would it be to turn into the real thing?" And I was like, I built it as if it was the real thing because I don't actually know how not to. So I don't know, some theming, a bit of testing, probably quite slow, needs speeding up. How about that? So I then kind of went from being like just a regular dev on the team to being made a senior developer. And I basically became like the informal front end lead for what became iPlayer Radio, which anybody in the UK will know is like the main radio platform in the UK on the website of it. So I did that for a couple of years, and stayed as a senior in that team. And then Ian, who was a senior in the platform engineering team, moved on to the accessibility team to join Gareth as like an accessibility specialist. And in order for him to move on, he needed to backfill his role in the platform engineering team. So I followed him in, essentially. I backfilled for him when he left for the accessibility team. I then did platform engineering for about 2 years. And then Henny left the BBC. And when Henny left, it left a headcount in the accessibility team. So I followed Ian for a second time and joined the accessibility team working with Gareth. And that was probably about 7 years ago. So yeah, that's how I kind of got from being a developer to kind of like a senior developer, and then finally into a dedicated accessibility role. And then in the last 7 years, my role has changed many times. It's gone through many iterations, but that's kind of a bit more of a story for later.
Well, I mean, you've been through so many challenges. Thanks for sharing the how things were with with your spinal injury, and I'm interested in the in the bike part of it. Maybe we could tack that on to the end. But then you also mentioned that you'd given a talk or written a paper about autism with respect to, I think, the opera browser. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about, the nature of that and what you wrote. What was it, a paper or a
It was a
presentation?
presentation.
What was the theme of that, and what did you help other people to understand?
So I was all of about 17 or 18, something like that. At the time, I just got to living in supported living. So I'd been homeless for a while, then living in a shelter, then living in supported living. And we had to do all sorts of paperwork in order for me to go to London. It was hilarious. It went from when I was homeless, nobody giving a damn, to when I'm in supported living, mountains of paperwork to do anything. It was kind of ironic. So yeah, so Henny Swan and the people at Opera arranged for me to come up to London, and I did a presentation just talking about how I use the web, what things work for me, what things don't work for me. I'm sure I probably have the copy of the slides around somewhere. And it's kind of the first time I talked about cognitive accessibility, but at the time it was just how I use the internet. I didn't know that it was a specific thing. I'd never watched somebody else use the internet, so I didn't know that what I was doing was different, if that makes any sense. Nobody like taps you on the shoulder and goes, by the way, most people don't do that, So I'd use the keyboard. I'd mix keyboard and mouse. I would, make things really big just to make all the adverts go away and all sorts of stuff. I didn't know that wasn't how everybody did it. So I kind of talked about that, and that's what I was, what, blimey, 15 years ago, and I've been doing 20 to 40 presentations a year since. So that was kind of my first kind of big public presentation about kind of web development stuff. And then I've just kind of gone from there, talk to talk to event to event. I suppose that train of stuff eventually kind of reached its climax, so to speak, at CSUN in 2017, where I went across with the BBC. So again, Gareth Ford Williams pops up, the head of accessibility for the BBC. I'd never flown, I'd never been on a plane, I'd never been to the US. I didn't have any speech most of the time. And Gareth was like, you should do a presentation in America. I'm sure that's totally doable. And he worked it out. He worked out how to get me and Lion and Mike, who's Wookie, the friend who I do the financial crime software with now, funnily enough, all the way across to the US to go and do this presentation at CSUN about cognitive accessibility one-on-one. So I'd kind of come up with this model of describing how I process things from a cognitive accessibility perspective. So I break it down into receiving, processing, and acting on information. So being able to receive information is being able to perceive it, color contrast, stuff like that. And then being able to identify the actions that are possible or the affordances. And then processing the information is like filtering and deciding. So filtering out all the information I don't want, all the buttons I don't want to press, all the things I'm not going to do, to hone in very slowly on the thing that I am going to do. So that's like your filtering and deciding. And then your acting is planning and doing. So how do I actually do the thing I've decided to do? Do I click a thing? Do I pull a thing? Do I drag a thing, etc.? And then doing is the ability to actually do that without dropping something or clicking the wrong thing or whatnot. So I kind of started talking about that model, and that kind of took off really big. So I went back to CSUN 3 years, I think, in a row, which was kind of through till, I think it was 2016, 17, and 2018. Might have been 2019. I think I took a year off in the middle, with different versions of that cognitive accessibility talk, and then went to many of the large organizations and did the same talk. And then kind of grew from there. It's also when I got involved in the W3C Cognitive Task Force. So I guess that's actually one of the things I'm doing right now that I kind of forgot about. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Cognitive Community Group. Oh yeah, about that thing.
Yeah,
I spend like that
that's
thing I
one
spend
of
2 days a month doing. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it.
you have an amazing amount of things in there that we have to keep catching up on. Just going back again a little bit. You mentioned that starting out, the way you were doing things was just the way that you'd been doing things, and you weren't aware that it was necessarily different or other people had those challenges. But I mean, as you started doing all these presentations, you must have started realizing that there were so many people with similar challenges that needed to be able to solve those, as you went along.
Yeah, and that was a big part of it. Was that I'd say that. So if I pick up the story where I started with the accessibility team, there was kind of three big changes at that time. The first change was it was the first time where I'd worked on a team where I wasn't trying to not be autistic, if that makes any sense. So up until the age of about 25, I would say that I was a person with autism. There is me and the autism, and they're separate. That didn't really work very well because fundamentally I'm autistic. It's part of me. It's the same as like my hair color or my height or my gender or sexuality or whatever. It's an ingrained part of me. And I got all the way to 25, and I basically had really bad burnout. So Gareth had hired me into the accessibility team, and about 6 months later, I almost dropped dead of gallstones. So I had this operation that was a bit last minute after I had these big gallstones. And after that operation, the anesthetic hadn't gone right or something had gone wrong. So actually, I lost my speech again for about 18 months. So my first kind of 2 years with the accessibility team as an accessibility specialist were mostly spent non-speaking or non-verbal without speech. And rather than being excluded or seeing myself as damaged or broken, we understood that this was just something I was going through, and it was the environment that needed to change to account for to remove the barriers. So a good example would be we used to have these team meetings where we'd all get on Skype, and everybody would talk, and then they'd go, "Hey Jamie, what do you think?" And I'd be typing something out, and it was the most frustrating thing I'd ever done because I was out of sync with everything else. And I kind of explained this to the team, kind of going, "This doesn't flow. This is driving me crazy." So we ended up all moving to Slack because that way we're all using the same communication channel. We're all kind of more equal in terms of communication, and then the communication flows better and there's less misunderstandings and everything goes quicker. So it's kind of slowing down to go fast, it's kind of this maxim of slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So we slowed down the communication so we all had an equal playing field, and then it all flowed much better. And then, yeah, it took a long time for my speech to come back and a lot of therapy and tools and AAC. So I kind of had that kind of at the start of it. And it was Gareth Ford Williams' thing of kind of explaining the social model to me, going, "Hey, actually, it's not that the autism is the disability. The autism is your impairment. It's describing something about you, but it's the environment that contains all the barriers, and it's the barriers that actually disable you." So at the time, I was doing things like if I had to go up to Salford, which is up in Manchester, about 200 miles away. I'd jump on the train by myself and get there and be completely broken. Like I would arrive in like survival mode. I have made it, just about alive. I haven't got hit by a train or a car, but I'm completely useless for 2 days because I'm just so overwhelmed by it. And Gareth was one of the person who started going, "Well, maybe we can get you some support with that, or you could travel up with somebody else and start to explore that." So Gareth had this really large role in my life, Gareth Ford Williams, where he was kind of helping me learn about myself. And as I learned that, I became more able to describe the barriers that I face to others, which is kind of what led to that accessibility talk at CSUN. I wrote it very quickly after we arrived in the US because I'd actually forgotten I was doing it. I had 3 scheduled all in the same day, and this one was in the middle of the day, and I basically finished it sat on the loo between the other 2 talks. Typical CSUN style, last minute, but it went really well, and all I was doing was talking about my experiences. And then kind of from there, kind of understanding that I'm not the only person who has these barriers, but the barriers have names, has become really useful. So that was kind of like the first 2 years when I was with the accessibility team. And then the next 5 kind of get even more crazy. But yeah, for those 2 years, I'm basically accessibility specialist. So I'm helping people with testing things, giving advice, doing little bits of research and prototyping. And of course, one of the big ones was finishing the BBC's mobile accessibility guidelines, partly because of me being in the team and partly because of Gareth and everybody else. Those guidelines were some of the first to include cognitive accessibility because we had first-hand experience of it in the team. So we could put those cognitive accessibility examples into the BBC's guidelines from the start. The BBC doesn't follow WCAG. Due to some interesting legal stuff, we have to have our own thing that we look after and we control. So we were using the BBC mobile accessibility guidelines, which were mostly written by Ian Pouncey and Henny Swan, with lots of other people helping. So that was kind of one of the first times that the barriers that I faced became something I could talk about in a useful way, and I could see that some of the challenges I had could also become a way to help others. And that was kind of the end. That was kind of like the first 2 years of my time within the accessibility team.
Well, so you just mentioned working on the standards and models for supporting cognitive disability, and that's always to me been the one disability that has gotten the least amount of attention or maybe progress in the digital accessibility world. I think maybe because it's a really difficult problem to figure out how to address and solve and support. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How do you kind of look at cognitive disabilities and accessibility, and what do you see as a good path forward for the profession to take?
That's a big question. I think we have a problem with abstraction. So when we think about cognitive stuff, when we think about cognitive disabilities or cognitive impairments, it's a bit more complicated than that. So let's roll back a step, right? What's a disability and what isn't? Well, in the UK, disability is defined by two things, which is, first of all, is that it has a substantial impact on your day-to-day living and that it lasts more than 12 months. You'll notice that nothing in there says anything about a diagnosis or a doctor even. It just says that it has a substantial impact on your life and it lasts more than 12 months. So if we took everybody in England and we flooded England to 20 feet and everybody had to swim everywhere and they could no longer do things because they couldn't swim well enough, well, now they've got a swimming disability because it's contextual, it's the environment. So when we say cognitive impairment, cognitive disability, what we're really saying is a bell curve. There is a bell distribution of ability on something, and 90% of people are between this middle part of the graph, but the graph goes off to the far sides. Now we have come to the point of judging that as an impairment or disability, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So one of the models that I kind of came to and have really learned to find very useful is the concept of neurodiversity. So say, for example, me, the medical words are autistic and ADHD. Somebody could say that I'm inattentive. I would say no. I would say that most barriers don't support my ability to tunnel and maintain focus. Most environments contain too many barriers. When, somebody might say that autistic people are hypersensitive to sound, I would say no, I'm sensitive to sound, but that's because the environment is badly designed for sound. What happens is when we start going down that medical path, the DSM-V path, we're actually making political decisions. So think of the DSM-V as an artifact of a bunch of political arguing. It's not actually, so DSM-V is the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. It's the thing that says what all the disorders are. That's not actually very useful. Most of it is political. Most of it is about funding. Most of it is about insurance codes. It's not actually an abject description of reality and the challenges that people face. And that's kind of really important. That what the diagnostic label says doesn't really tell us much about the needs of the person, right? So for me, when I think about cognitive, I'm not thinking about the names of disorders. I'm not thinking about the medical model. I'm thinking about the social model and the nature of the barriers. So what are the most common barriers for people with a cognitive difference, or what are the most common barriers for people? When we try and think of cognitive accessibility as the disabled people and the not disabled people, we're missing out on people who are tired. Everybody has this changing ability. One of the models that we use is this description of ability, capability, and capacity. So ability is the list of everything you can do, which for me includes flying a small aircraft. Capability is all the things you can do today. And capacity is how many of those things can you do today. So I might be able to do 100 things. I might be capable of doing, 5 of those things today, but I might only have the capacity to do 2 of them. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as energy accounting or spoons. So if you ever come across spoons or that sort of thing, that's what it's referring to as energy and capacity. You can take somebody who has no cognitive disability, get them tired enough, and they will have cognitive disability suddenly. It's not that they've changed, it's that the environment has changed, the situation has changed. They're no longer as capable as they were before. They've still got the ability, but they currently don't have enough capacity to use to do what they're capable of. Does that make sense? That people exist on this constantly changing spectrum of ability. And trying to draw a hard line and say, this is the disabled point and this isn't, that's not a useful thing to be doing. Um, Instead, to looking at it and going, people vary, but generally speaking, the barriers are similar. They are things like memory, there are things like recognition, there are things like language processing and speech. Everybody can have these problems at different times. And then what we need to do is we need to make sure that when we build things, we don't build things in a way that they include barriers relating to that sort of thing. Um, and this kind of focus on barriers, not on diagnosis, not on WCAG, but where are the barriers within the thing, has kind of become the model that we used at the BBC, which also led to some of the research I did about VR and XR and that sort of thing. So I guess in a nutshell, cognitive accessibility and usability are two sides of the same coin. They blend together, and it's really a political decision about what's usability and what's accessibility. Um, and I generally come to this discussion by going, who's deciding where that line is? If the deciding of that line is the DSMV and what's a medical diagnosis, well, that's basically driven by politics and money in the insurance industry. It's not actually based on what works for people. Or do we define that line based on our own communities and experiences and the audiences that we serve? So that's kind of the way I think about it. The more we can understand about the audience and the barriers that the audience face, the more we can do to resolve those barriers. So one of the phrases I sometimes use is that we encode the assumptions we make about others into the things we build in the form of barriers. So when I assume that everybody can remember 20 things, and I just have that assumption in my head and I build my to-do list manager, I don't challenge myself to go, actually, how about people who can remember 5 things or people who can remember 30 things? So those assumptions that we make about the ability of others for speech, language, memory, all sorts of different things like that, we create barriers in what we do because we encode those assumptions into what we do. Now, we can always think about really clever solutions. So we can have screen readers and specialist overlays and all sorts of stuff. But actually, it's more effective to make better assumptions at the start. So a lot of what I do is talking to people about what they're doing and the assumptions they've made and helping them make better assumptions. It's why I kind of say to people that I have an assumptions and barriers focused model of accessibility. It's not about WCAG, it's not about compliance. It's about talking to a team and going, who are you going to exclude today? Who are you happy to exclude? And when I say that to people, people go, whoa, you can't exclude anyone. They'll be like, okay, so does the BBC News homepage have to work for toddlers? No? It's okay to exclude users under 5? Great, write it down. Nothing is for everyone. But even if you take a completely blank web page and you write 10 words on it, it's going to exclude someone. So owning that and making it deliberate, and then thinking about who you're excluding and why you're excluding them, and then making sure you don't exclude anyone else is kind of the art of accessibility. It's not about trying to include everyone. It's about agreeing who you're going to exclude and then holding yourself to that line and making sure you don't exclude anyone else. Does that help? That's a very long, wobbly explanation of Jamie's philosophy of accessibility, really.
Well, you, it was extremely helpful, and so you gave me a lot to think about myself. Especially continuing as you referenced barriers, and that's just a whole thing I have to take some time myself to think about in a different way. And so I really appreciate that your expression of that, because it's very helpful, and I think it's will be helpful to a lot of other people that listen to this episode. And I appreciate your live life expression, and really helps me get a greater understanding for
Can I,
those particular challenges.
can I give you 3 examples of barriers and how we came to face them and rethink life to overcome them? I think it might be useful. There are examples from my own life. So on the story, we're up to about 5 years ago, right? I'm back to being verbal, and I moved my role from being a senior accessibility specialist to a senior research engineer. And at that time, I started being more involved in BBC's research, so user testing, user research, R&D, all that sort of stuff. And I was still kind of splitting my time half and half between that and supporting other members of the team on kind of accessibility stuff within the products, so news, iPlayer, weather, all that sort of stuff. And I remember having a conversation with Gareth probably about 3 years ago, where I basically said to him, Gareth, I'm really annoyed. Like these people, they've published a bunch of accessibility guidelines for VR. They're all speculation. There's no data. I don't know what the barriers they're solving are. It's a list of solutions, but I don't know the problem. Can I do a thing? And he basically went, yeah, sure. Let me know what it is you want to do. And I was like, well, if I like made a VR thing and then went to lots of places with lots of people and just wrote down what didn't work, what the barriers were, and then we made a really big list of them, and then we kind of sorted them all out and grouped them, we could describe the problems with VR, which need solutions, rather than the solutions. And maybe when we do that, we can design out the problems in the first place. So then we don't need the clever solution. Gareth basically went, yeah, that sounds good. So that year, rather than buy me a Mac for my 3 yearly BBC laptop upgrade, we got a little VR machine, and I taught myself how to build a VR environment pretty much over a weekend. It was pretty much come in on Tuesday. I think it was a long weekend, and I came in on the Tuesday and was like, "Ta-da, Gareth! I've got VR now." It was like, "When did you last sleep?" Like Thursday. I think I've been awake about 60, 40 to 60 hours. I fell asleep a little bit in the middle. I can't remember when. And he was like, "That's great, Jane. You go home and get some sleep." But we had this VR environment. It's a model of a school library. And we started playing with it. We could started taking it places. So we took it to special schools, because I know lots of different people who run special schools. We took it to community centres and care homes, and we worked with 107 users. Well, we worked with 107 users, but we're pretty sure some of them were the same users twice. Because of the way we collected the data, we can't actually rule out the duplicates, which is kind of funny. It's almost like someone turned up with a moustache and was like, "Yes, I'm definitely somebody different. Please, can I have another go?" And I couldn't tell them all apart, so I said, "Yeah, sure, jump on in." And from that, we observed something like 1,700 barriers, so like 1,700 barriers, which we then focused down and processed, removed all the duplicates, and got down to about 25 common barriers grouped by impairment. And that became the BBC's XR barriers research, which was kind of the last. It took us 3 years, but it was kind of like the last big thing I delivered before I left the BBC. So that was taking that barriers approach to a new piece of technology and going, what are the barriers involved in this? The barriers are things like expectations, comprehension, wayfinding, controls, multiple input, all that sort of stuff. If you Google BBC XR barriers research, it'll all come up. But that was taking that barriers approach. Now, at the same time, some big changes happened in my life. So, as I said, I kind of had speech and didn't have speech, and I've been trying to learn to live independently for literally 15 years. It's always been a struggle. I get very muddled. I have trouble keeping up, and I've always had kind of support at home helping me to stay safe. And the approach that we took was this idea of understanding a barrier and then finding a tool. So a great example being, I don't really use open cups. I just use sippy cups. I don't actually have one with me right now. This is one of the rare occasions I actually have a bottle of water with a screw top. And you'll notice that every time I take a sip, I'm screwing the top back on because I'm going to spin it. I always do. So we started with this idea of, I've got 10 spoons a day. How do I make the most of it? Well, every little optimization, having sippy cups rather than using, open top containers, that saves me a bit. The noise of, metal cutlery on plates, it's really painful. So I don't have any china plates, so the noise doesn't matter. All of these little things, but they're each optimizations that reduce the barriers in my life and enabled me to live more independently and to start to thrive. So that kind of takes us up to, I'd say, about a year and a half ago, which is when my life got really interesting. But I think I'll stop for now and bounce back to you, and then we can finish and I can tell you the last 18 months.
Well, this has been a good journey, and it sounds like then there's some other activities that took place after the BBC, that
So,
that you wanted to chat about.
so that happened while I was at the BBC. So 18 months ago, in February 2021, I woke up one day in the most amount of pain I've ever been in. I don't have the words to describe the amount of pain I was in. It was lying on the floor screaming and screaming and screaming. The friends who took me to hospital basically said they'd never heard a person make those noises before, and I hope they never do again. And long story short, I'd had an infection in my kidneys that had got into my blood and caused sepsis. And we think, we don't entirely know for sure, that whilst that had happened, the nerves that go down to my legs were crushed. So at the bottom of your spinal cord, you've got a thing called the cauda equina. It's like a horse-shaped bunch of nerves. And mine had got damaged. So it's something called cauda equina syndrome, which is a type of spinal cord injury. So I went from literally one day of riding 40 kilometers and doing my job and traveling the country doing talks and working with BBC teams and stuff to not being able to stand and not being able to walk and not being able to do a lot of things I used to do. I basically spent 3 months lying down. Um, and that was probably one of the hardest moments of my life when suddenly everything changed. And when we speak to the doctors, they didn't really know what the answer was. They're like, well, it's cauda equina syndrome. It's got lots of different causes. There's nothing we can do about it. One doctor helpfully popped up and like, oh no, we will know the cause when we autopsy you. We'll know exactly what the cause was, whether it was infectious or not. And I was like, oh, thanks. That's not very useful. So we took that barriers model again, and we just said, okay, I can't move much. What's important to me? Well, okay, I need to lie flat, but I can have a day bed and a night bed, so I have a day-night cycle again. How do I look after the pain? Well, I need to sit in certain ways. I need to learn what my body can and can't do. So we basically completely redesigned my flat and my life, taking this barriers-led approach, working out where the barriers were and what we could do about them. Now, at the same time, having been a mountain biker for 20 years, the biggest harm to my mental health, the biggest grief was either a forced change of identity, so for example, not being a mountain biker anymore, and the loss of control that I had over my life because I couldn't get to the lounge, I couldn't get to the bathroom, let alone anything else. I had to trust my friends and the people doing my sport. So over time, I had these first 3 months, and kind of two things happened. The first one is that my team at the BBC were just amazing. It wasn't even like Jamie's on sick leave. No, we're an accessibility team and I needed accessibility help. They were there for every single conversation, working out how to do things. And Gareth and Becky and Charlie and Emma and Mick Math, they're all amazing people. And they've all now actually left the BBC, thinking of it. And we worked it through and we kind of understood bit by bit. And over those first 3 months, I spoke to every adaptive cycling company I could find in the UK until I eventually got myself onto like a recumbent tricycle. And from the recumbent trike, we proved that I could still pedal. I just couldn't hold my body weight up whilst I did it. We then found, different physios and all sorts of stuff. And we found that I had a strong standing position. Couldn't walk much, but I could stand up. We also found that I couldn't sit up straight. So you might notice I'm in a big blue chair with a big strap. I don't have much strength side to side anymore. So if I don't do the straps up and I'm not careful, I just kind of fall sideways. It also really hurts my sides. I can't feel my feet and my legs are a bit rubbish and that sort of stuff. But I had this strong standing position. So we proved that I could sort of pedal using the recumbent tricycle. We called it the Dakar deck chair because it's like a deck chair with big tires on it for going down mountains. And then we built a whole series of prototype bikes that I could basically stand on top of. So if you imagine standing with your fat feet on the floor and your hands flat on the wall, that's a strong position for me. I can do that. So we built a bike that could fit underneath me when I did that. And it ended up being 4 different prototypes before we went to one of the bike manufacturers. And then we custom built that little creation over in the corner. And that's how I go mountain biking. If I rolled it out and you looked at it, you'd go, looks like a bike that's been kind of squished. That's what we did. The front end is really, really high. The pedals are really, really low, and it's got a motor. So I can sit on it and twiddle my legs, and the motor does all the pedaling for me, get to the top, stand up in my strong position, and roll down the other side. It's got 160 mil, 6 inches of suspension travel both ends, so I could take out all the bumps, and away I go. So within, I think it was about 4 months of my injury, we proved that I could roll down a hill on a bike. And then about 9 months after my injury, we'd finished the initial build of that bike. And it's got like a prototype that's constantly developing. So I get this slightly weird experience of kind of, I'm a research engineer, right? And Gareth turned around and said, when I had my injury, it's like, well, you're a research engineer, you're now your own topic. You need to research your own barriers and fix those. And the bike is a good example of that. So is this chair and all the other different tools that we found and developed. Another example would be rather than have a wheelchair, I have a big buggy because the wheelchairs that can hold me in the right position are basically horrible. You sit in them, you can't see anything. You're reclined all the way back. You feel extremely vulnerable. It's a horrible feeling. But if you're in a buggy, you're down protected, nice and low. You've got a canopy over you. You know, it's nice and comfortable. So we just looked at the barriers, and then each time we had a barrier, we iterated on it, found a solution, and then just kind of improved over time. So the other thing that I do is I monologue, and I'm pretty sure that was a monologue. So there you go. There's another like huge heap of Jamie life stuff.
Well, Jamie, it's been a pleasure talking with you about this, and I learned a lot. Appreciate hearing your story, and hopefully we'll meet at CSUN or another event at some point.
Sure. Woo, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.